How are you? It's Dr. Amoso. Today we want to talk about the acts that were introduced by the settlers in Southern Rhodesia when the Shona and the Ndebele were defeated in the Ndebele Shona uprisings of 1896. The whites were now in total control of Mashonaland and Matebeleland. So they could introduce different acts which were meant to make them have adequate labor. They took the lands of the local people. When they took the lands of the local people, they wanted to have people who were going to work on their lands and also on their mines. So which were the acts that they introduced? You talk about the Labor Bureau Act, which was introduced. It was an instrument to recruit labor, to use the Africans, the mines, and also farms. The main recruitment method that was used was called Jibaro. People were forced to go and work at their mines and also farms. So we talk about the Labor Bureau Act, which had to force, which had to make people leave their areas, leave their dwellings, going to the mines, farms that were now possessed by the whites. Then you move on and also talk about the Master Servant Ordinance of 1901. So the Master and Servant Ordinance was introduced in 1901 and it operated throughout the colonial period. The Act stipulated the number of working hours per contract period and it allowed employees to engage laborers for more than the calendars a day. This was meant now to make the whites have superiority, to make the whites have an advantage over the Africans. Africans are talking about the Shona and the Ndebele. So the Master and Servant Act now, it allowed the whites to become the masters. It allowed the whites to have power over the local people. So we talk about the Master and Servant Act of 1901. Then also talk about the Pass Laws of 1902. So we are talking about people, when they wanted to move, they were supposed to carry with them a pass. If you wanted to travel, you were supposed to carry a pass so that you could travel from one area to another. And if you were caught without a pass, you were arrested. When you were arrested now, they could send you to any farm or mine to go and work. So you talk about the Pass Law. Also talk about the African Labor Regulation Act of 1911. So this act, this legislation, it was enacted to cover employees or employers in agriculture and mining. It controlled labor movement by blocking workers from switching employment for higher wages. This act, it was as a result, of so many mines, so many farms that had been established. So people were abandoning their workplaces. Why? Because of the salaries that they were paid, which were not adequate. Then they sought for employment at another farm. So the act was meant to stop those movements that the Africans were doing, moving from one farm, one mine, looking for employment. So it was meant to regulate the Africans so that they could not move everywhere searching for employment. They were supposed to remain at one place for a long period of time. You talk about the Labor Bureau Act of 1912. The act, we see that as it was established in 1912, it was unpopular to the people. Why? They saw it as Chibaro. So the Africans, we see them resisting this so-called the Labor Bureau Act, but we see that there was nothing much that they could have done. They also talk about the compound system. It's another method that the whites had to do anons makomboni. So we see that at any mine, at any farm, a komboni was established whereby people were supposed to go to work, but at the end of the day they were supposed to stay at a mine or at a farm. So the compound system, again, it was a system, it was an act which yet to regulate the Africans so that they could not continue or they could not go back to their areas of origin. You also talk about the 1923 Industrial Conciliation Act. This will see that it was responsible for regulating the wages and working conditions in the industrial sector, the Industrial Conciliation Act. You also talk about the 1927 Trade Union Act. The act provided for the restoration of trade unions and regulations for their activities. Africans were now rebelling, they were now revolting, they were now saying that if you wanted to do any rebellions, you're supposed to be registered. So we see that it was meant to avoid trade unions from influencing their workers to rebel against the colonial settlers. You talk about the 1933 Wages Board Act. This was again responsible for setting up minimum wages that workers were supposed to receive. Then we move on, also talk about another act which was established, which was called the 1947 Labor Relation Act, relations between employees and employers. Then we talk about the 1953 Employment Women and Young Person Act, which also regulated how people were supposed to be employed. So there were so many of these acts. If you move on, talk about again the Land Husbandry Act, later on being introduced in 1951, the Land Apportionment Act of 1930. So there were so many of these acts that were introduced by the colonial people, by the colonial settlers. These acts were meant to subjugate the Africans so that they could work for them in their mines and also farms. Thank you so much. It's Dr. Monso.